The UK was very divided during the 20th century, and still is. And today's topic is about a man who was a part of a different faction within the UK and stood for something totally different in its history. Our story starts off in November 16th, 1896, in Mayfield, London, where Oswald Mosley would be born. His father, Sir Oswald Mosley, belonged to a wealthy and well-connected aristocratic family. He was known for being irresponsible, pleasure-seeking, and often absent. He separated from his wife, Oswald's mother, not long after Oswald was born. This neglectful upbringing shaped young Mosley's desire for recognition and control later in his life. Oswald's mother, Lady Catherine Maud Mosley, came from a prominent, steadfast family. She was known for her strong will and beauty. After separating from her husband, she largely raised Oswald and his siblings on her own. She provided a strict but ambitious atmosphere, pushing her son towards high achievements. So Mosley grew up mostly under the influence of his mother, while his father was largely absent and seen as irresponsible. Mosleys were a still well-connected aristocratic family. They owned large estates and had deep ties to political and land. His double aristocratic inheritance, both land and industrial wealth, gave him a title and an elite education at Winchester College and Sandhurst. These connections eased his early entry into conservative politics before he became a Labour Party MP, and later founded the British Union of Fascists. Even after he was disgraced for his fascist ties, his backgrounds meant he remained part of an elite circle. At Pittody Hall was a large Victorian country estate with servants and privileges of aristocratic life. Oswald grew up, craving admiration and control and wanting to prove himself. He also developed a rebellious streak, distrusting authorities unless it was his own. As a boy, he was sent to West Downs Preparatory School, where he gained a reputation for his charm, but also his arrogance and mischief. During his time in this school really shaped his personality. West Downs School is one of the most prestigious prep schools in England, feeding boys into elite institutions like Winchester College. The school emphasized discipline, sports, leadership, and public service. The school was also like a stepping stone for preparing boys for upper-class roles in society. It was strict, with a culture of competition both academically and physically. Mosley entered as a boy of privilege due to his air of aristocratic life. This gave him autonomy, prestigious among his peers, but he also had to live up to expectations, which he quickly gained a reputation for charm, cleverness, and his athletic ability. Teachers noted that he was brilliant, but restless. He also showed signs of the arrogance and impatience that would mark him later in life. He disliked rules unless he was the one enforcing them. He at times could be overconfident, alienating classmates, and he was bright, especially in history and literature, but not a hard-working student. He relied more on quick wit and natural intelligence than sustained effort. His teachers often described him as, quote, capable of great things but easily distracted, end quote. Sports were central to the school, and Mosley excelled at them. He was particularly strong in fencing, boxing, and athletics, which gave him confidence and physical prowess. This early emphasis on physicality fed into his later love of parades, uniforms, and the martial style of politics. At West Downs, Mosley's charisma and ambition and competitive thirst became visible. From the beginning, it was clear that he loved being at the center of attention, organizing groups of boys around him. This would foreshadow his later political rallies, but he also clashed with authority, showing flashes of defiance against teachers when he felt restricted. Prep school life taught Mosley the confidence of leadership and the importance of discipline and spectacle. However, it also encouraged his tendency to see himself to set apart from others, destined for a special role. In the years 1908 to 1914, Oswald would enroll into Winchester College. Winchester was, and still is, known for its rigorous academics and classical education, an emphasis on tradition, hierarchy, and leadership. Boys who attended lived under a strict routine, wearing gowns, studying Latin and Greek, and competing in sports. The school prized confidence and leadership, quality Mosley had in abundance. He was bright and intellectually quick, but just as West Downs, not a diligent student. He preferred debating over heavy study. He had a sharp tongue and enjoyed arguing for the sake of winning. Teachers often described him as gifted but undisciplined, more interested in showing brilliance than mastering the subjects. His natural athleticism and his aristocratic confidence gave him a kind of swagger among his peers. He loved physical competition, but also the theoretical side of sports. The idea of performance, display, and victory often filled his mind. Among his peers, he could be magnetic. He had a knack for drawing boys into his orbit, but he also provoked jealousy and resentment. During this time, his leadership personality really showed, even in school groups. Mosley naturally took charge, rehearsing the role of commander. Even at this young age, he already showed a belief in his own special destiny, seeing himself as different from ordinary boys. He also thrived in conversation and debate, skills that would later serve him in politics and public speaking. When he finished his time at Winchester College, he went straight into the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, aiming for a commissary in the army, partly because he craved action, and probably because aristocratic tradition demanded it, and there was a tradition. At the end of his time in Winchester, Mosley developed the intellectual flair and physical confidence and sense of superiority that defined his later career. He wasn't the best student, but became known as a charismatic, bold, and destined for leadership. Traits that drew people in as much as they repelled others. Now we come to the real turning point in Mosley's youth, his military training at Sandhurst, and his experience in the First World War. From 1914 to 1918, it hardened him and gave him a taste of leadership, and also left him physically scarred, all of which fuels his later political persona. After leaving Winchester, Mosley entered Sandhurst, the training ground for British Army officers, in 1914. At Sandhurst, he showed the same traits as which in school, which were bold, energetic, and self-confident, and quick to take charge. However, his time there was cut short. He was expelled from a drunken brawl and insubordination. When World War I broke out in 1914, Mosley joined the Queen's 16th Lancers, which was a cavalry regiment. He was sent to the Western Front in France, but during his time there, cavalry quickly became outdated in trench warfare, so Mosley spent most of his time in both combat and on foot. He developed a reputation for being brave and reckless. He liked to take risks and show daring, which impressed some but worried others. As the war dragged on in 1915, during active service, Mosley was badly injured in a training accident. He fractured his ankle and knee in a horse riding fall. This injury never healed properly and caused him lifelong pain. But instead of giving in and retiring, which most people in this situation would have done, he showed extraordinary determination, and he had his legs strapped into a brace so he could return to duty. At one point, he even fought while leaning on a walking stick, refusing to be sidelined. This gave him a reputation as fearless and almost theoretical in his courage. While recovering from his injuries, Mosley began to think about the failures of Britain's leadership in the war. He admired bravery in action, but he also despised incompetence and bureaucracy. These frustrations planted the seeds of his later authoritarian outlook. He wanted a system that was fast, efficient, and led by strong men, not by committees. By the end of the war in 1918, Mosley was no longer at the front, but he had earned a respect as a courageous officer. He finished the war with the rank of lieutenant. His experiences in aristocratic duty, injury and defiance of limits and bitterness at political inefficiency set the stage for his dramatic entry into politics right after the war. At Sandhurst and in World War I, Mosley revealed the same traits that defined him his whole life, which were bravery, arrogance, theatrical flair, and impatience with authority. His war injury became part of his identity. He made it into a badge of honor, proof that he was a man of action who refused to be weak. This is when he transformed from a young war hero into one of the most talked about rising stars in British politics. At the end of the war, Britain held a general election in December 1918. Mosley, who at the time was just 22, stood as a Conservative candidate for Yorkshire. This was accomplished by his war record, aristocratic background, and powerful family. He won easily, becoming one of the youngest MPs in Parliament. Once in the House of Commons, Mosley stood out immediately. Tall, handsome, and charismatic, he drew attention wherever he spoke. His speeches were fiery, clever, and delivered with great confidence, but he quickly revealed his independent streak. He criticized the Conservative government for inefficiency and lack of vision. He was impatient with tradition and disliked the slow, cautious style of Parliament, and wanted something more active instead of passive. From 1920 to 1922, Mosley grew frustrated with the Conservative Party's policy, especially on Ireland, where independence movements were intensifying, and on social reforms at home. In 1920, he broke away from the Conservatives, which was a shocking move for a young aristocratic with a safe seat. He briefly sat as independent MP. This bold defection earned him a reputation as a fearless maverick, but also as unreliable and arrogant in the eyes of party leaders. He was also at this time making powerful personal connections. In 1920, he married Lady Cassina Curzon, daughter of Lord Curzon, one of the most powerful statesmen of the era. The wedding was so high profile that Winston Churchill attended. But by 1924, Mosley's political journey took a decisive turn. Disillusioned with the Conservatives, he gravitated toward the Labour Party, which was emerging as a true representative of the British working class. There were a couple of reasons why he made the shift. Mosley believed Britain faced deep economic and social problems after the First World War, one of them being mass unemployment, poverty, and industrial unrest. The solution to this problem was something that was bold and innovative. Oswald had more frustration with the old order. He saw the traditional parties like Conservative and Liberals as unimaginative and cautious, and unable to meet the challenges of the modern world. The Labour Party was more fitting to his personality, which offered him a platform where his fiery speech and visionary rhetoric could be shine. In 1924, Mosley formally joined the Labour Party. His speeches, delivered with passions and intellectual flair, quickly made him one of the Labour Party's most visible young stars. Unlike many in this party, Mosley combined aristocratic background with radical ideas, which gave him a unique profile in British politics. The Labour Party briefly formed a minority government in 1924, but it collapsed within months. Mosley ran as a Labour candidate, but lost his seat, which made his career hit a temporary pause. In 1926, he won the election by Smethwick in an industrial constitutional near Birmingham. This was the key moment. Mosley now represented a working-class seat, very different from his aristocratic background. He quickly became a Labour Party celebrity, admired for his speech and the way he could connect with ordinary workers despite his upper-class roots. He was also quickly starting to rise up the ranks. In 1929, the Labour Party returned to power under Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. Mosley, only 32 years old, was appointed to the government as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, a junior cabinet post with responsibility for tackling unemployment. Expectations were high. He was seen as a future leader of the Labour Party, and even possible Prime Minister one day. In the early 1930s, Britain was hit by the Great Depression, and unemployment soared past 2 million. Mosley believed the Labour Party's cautious policies were failing, and he wanted radical action which could mean large-scale public works to create jobs, protectionist tariffs to shield Britain industry, and a strong state directing the economy with bold planning. He outlined these ideas in what would be known as the Mosley Memorandum. This was another turning point in his career. The plan was bold, modern, and arguably ahead of its time, but it terrified most labor leaders, who saw it as it was too extreme and risky. Here's what it consisted of. First, it would need state intervention, which called for a national economic plan driven by the government. Public works would be needed to create stability in the job market, which proposed large-scale infrastructural programs, which would include housing, transportation, and electrification, to absorb unemployment. It would also need import controls, suggested tariffs and protection for key industries to shield Britain from global competition. And there would also need to be financial reforms, which advocated government control of credit and investment, rather than leaving it to private banks, which would make a profit if people were in debt. Industrial rationalism. This program wanted inefficient industrials merged or reorganized under a state guidance. But the leader of the party, including Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald and Chancellor Philip Snowden, rejected it. They saw it as too radical and impractical. The Trade Union Congress and Labour Party left it founding appealing, but it was never adopted. Its rejection deepened Mosley's frustration with the party's cautiousness. The memorandum foreshadowed many of the policies Britain would later adopt during World War II and after. Its rejection was a turning point for Mosley and made him think about other options he could pursue. The rejection of the Mosley Memorandum in 1930 was another turning point. Mosley had poured his energy into this plan, and convinced it offered Britain a path of economic ruin. When Labour Party dismissed it, he saw no future inside the party. So in May 1930, he resigned from the government, and by early 1931, he left the Labour Party altogether. The same year, he launched a new political venture. It would become a new party. The new party promised bold solutions, where the Labour Party and the Conservatives offered only caution. Its programs echoed the Mosley Memorandum, public works and economic planning, and vigorous state intervention. Mosley presented it as a modern, dynamic alternative to the tired old parties. At first, the new party attracted attention. Some young intellectuals, professionals, and disillusioned Labour supporters joined, drawn by Mosley's energy and vision. He seemed to embody youthful confidence at a time where Britain politics felt stagnant. But the new political party quickly ran into trouble. It lacked deep roots among workers and unions, and its message failed to win over voters in 1931 general election. Most of its candidates, including Mosley, were decisively defeated. Still, for Mosley, the new party was just the beginning. The failure convinced him that Britain's problems required not just new policies, but a new style of politics altogether, one that emphasized discipline, strength, and unity. The crushing defeat of the new party in 1931 was a humiliating blow for Mosley. His movement and promised energy and modern ideas, but the voters overwhelmingly rejected it. For most politicians, that might have been the end of it, but for Mosley, it was a crossroads. Looking abroad, he's struck by the apparent success of Benito Mussolini in Italy, who had taken a struggling post-war nation and, through fascism, created what seemed to be order, discipline, and national revival. To Mosley, this offered a model of the strong, decisive leadership he believed Britain desperately needed. In 1932, Mosley transformed the remnants of the new party into the British Union of Fascists. Its program blended his early economic ideas with new authoritarian edge. The BUF, or British Union of Fascists, quickly drew attention. Its rallies and fiery speech and bold symbolism appealed to some of those who were frustrated by unemployment and political deadlock. By 1934, it claimed tens of thousands of members, including influential bankers from sections of the press. Things were looking up for Mosley, and his party in its early years, the British Union of Fascists, grew rapidly. By 1934, membership may have reached 40 to 50,000, and Mosley was drawing huge crowds to his rally. He presented the BUF as a movement of energy, discipline, and modern solutions, contrasting it with what he called the old gang, of conservatives and Labour Party. For a time, the BUF enjoyed support from the press, mostly famously Lord Rothermore Daily Mail, which ran the headline, quote, "Hurrah for the Blackshirts," end quote. In January 1934, the endorsement gave Mosley unpredicted visibility, but the movement didn't last. At the Olympia rally in 1934, one of the BUF's largest events turned into a disaster, when the BUF stewards finally attacked hecklers in front of thousands of spectators. This shocking scene of brutality, fists, baton, and boots were widely reported in the press. Public opinion started to shift sharply against Mosley, and many former supporters abandoned him. By 1935, Mosley openly adopted anti-Jewish rhetoric. This narrowed the BUF's appeal and alienated much of its mainstream, Britain. Another setback would occur in the Cable Street in October 1936, where Mosley attempted to march his Blackshirts through London's East End, home to a large Jewish community. Tens of thousands of anti-fascist demonstrators, Jewish residents and trade unionists and socialists and ordinary Londoners mobilized to block the march. Violent clashes erupted, and the police were forced to reroute the BUF. The Cable Street became a symbol of popular resistance to fascism in Britain, and a humiliating setback for Mosley. By the late 1930s, the BUF was in a steep decline. When World War II broke out in September 1939, the BUF's fortune collapsed almost overnight. Mosley had long admired aspects of Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, and his movement ties to European fascism now looked like outright sympathy with Britain's enemies. But Mosley was anti-war. He calls for peace with Germany, arguing that Britain should avoid another devastating war. To many, his position looked dangerously close to treason. Public hostility toward him and the BUF intensified. In May 1940, following Germany's rapid victories in Western Europe, the British government moved decisively. Under Defiance Regulation 18B, Mosley and hundreds of leaders from the BUF were interned without trial, and as a threat to national security. Mosley was imprisoned in Brixton Prison, later moved to Holloway to be with his wife, Diana, who he had married in 1936, in a ceremony hosted by Joseph Goebbels with Hitler himself as a guest. The BUF was officially banned and its organization effectively dismantled. After 3 years in custody, Mosley was released in 1943 on healthy grounds, under strict house arrest. His return to freedom drew public outrage. Many still viewed him as a traitor who had flirted with Britain's enemies at his darkest hour. By the war's end in 1945, Mosley's reputation was shattered. The BUF was gone, and he had become a symbol of betrayal and extremism in British political memory. In the late 1940s, he tried to make a comeback, and he founded the Union movement, presenting it as a fresh start after the BUF. He promoted the idea of Europe, a nation, a vision of a united Europe under authoritarian leadership that could rival the United States and the Soviet Union. He also continued to stress themes of economic planning and nationalism, but the shadow of fascism never left him. His Union movement gained a little traction in post-war Britain, where memories of the war made his politics toxic. He was harassed everywhere he went. Whenever he attempted to speak, Mosley was met with protesting, heckling, and sometimes outright riots. Anti-fascist demonstrations made it almost impossible for him to organize a serious movement. By the 1960s, Mosley largely abandoned any attempts at mass politics. He wrote memoirs, My Life, 1968. It gave occasional interviews and tried to defend his career as the work of a patriot misunderstood by history. In his final years, Mosley lived mostly abroad, especially in France and Ireland. He remained unrepentant about his choices, never fully disavowing fascism or apologizing for his wartime stance. Oswald Mosley died on November 3, 1980, at his home near Paris. This cause of death was Parkinson's disease, which he had been suffering for several years. He was 84 years old. After his death, his body was cremated in Paris, and his ashes were later scattered in the garden of his wife, Diana, in their home in Orsay. A question that still remains is, what would he say if he saw modern-day Britain? We can't know for certain, but based on Mosley's writing, speeches, and post-war interviews, we can make a guess. Mosley was an ardent nationalist who wanted a homogeneous Britain. He almost certainly would be hostile to the UK's modern diversity immigration from the Commonwealth and multicultural society. In his worldview, this world had been represented a loss of national unity. Mosley lamented the fall of the British Empire, but later advocated for a united Europe. He might see the EU before Brexit as a partial fulfillment of his vision, though not authoritarian or centralized enough for his taste. Post-Brexit, he might frame it as Britain retreating instead of leading a continental bloc. Mosley opposed laissez-faire capitalism and believed in a strong interventional state. He would likely condemn modern globalized, finance-driven Britain, arguing it left working-class communities behind. He might support big state-led infrastructure parties, but reject free market globalization. Mosley despised that he saw as a weak, bickering party politics. He would likely be seething about the modern-day British politics, which meant coalitions, party infighting, and short-term leadership. He would argue Britain needed decisive, centralized authority, rather than, quote, parliamentary muddle, unquote. Mosley styles himself as a man of discipline, order, and hierarchy. He would probably denounce modern British liberalism, social freedoms, and what he saw as, quote, decadence. In short, he likely claimed the UK had lost its sense of strength and purpose. He would almost certainly see the UK as a proof of his old warnings, arguing that democracy would lead to weakness. Immigration had eroded national unity, and global capitalism had undermined ordinary people. But his proposed solutions, authoritarianism, nationalism, and corporatism, would clash completely with Britain's modern liberal democratic identity. But we will never know what Oswald Mosley's UK would have looked like and how it would shape modern-day politics. By the looks of how the UK is today, it seems that liberalism has failed, and the people living there are fed up with the current political order.